Welcome to Women and Resistance, a powerful podcast where we honor the courage, resilience, and revolutionary spirits of women across the globe. Hosted by Ayafubere Eneli Esquire and Adesoji Iginla, we uncover untold stories of defiance against systemic oppression. Whether colonialism, racism, sexism, or economic injustice. From historic icons like Winnie Mandela and Fannie Lou Hamer to today's trailblazers, we shine a light upon those shaping a more just world. This is a call to honor the past, embrace the present, and build an empowered future. Yes, greetings, and welcome to another episode of Women in Resistance. I am your host, Adesoji Iginla, and with me, as usual, before she goes into character, is Ayafubere Eneli Esquire. And we welcome you all to another episode. This week, we going into the heart of Africa, Central Africa to be precise, what we'll now known as Uganda. But it wasn't exactly Uganda as we know it today. So for that story, for that understanding, we are going to travel through the eyes of a princess, Elizabeth of Toro. So the question goes, imagine this, you're a princess, your father is a king. Your kingdom stretches across mountains, lakes of western Uganda, with roots older than the British Empire that now claims to own it. You attend elite schools in England, and the only black girl in every room you enter. You graduate from Cambridge and you're called to the English bar. You're the first East African woman in history to achieve that. You come home and a dictator is now running your country. To understand what that experience is like and how she navigated it, we're going to speak to Elizabeth of Toro. Welcome, Princess.
Good evening.
Yes, good evening. Okay. Protocols aside, could you just give us a brief insight into what it was like growing up in Uganda?
Well, I want to thank you for that very thorough and very generous introduction. It is such an honor to be with you and your guests this evening. And what better way to spend the evening than to talk really not so much about my life, although of course we'll touch on that, but to my culture and my country and how it has been shaped. So I understand that you have had the occasion to interview an impressive line of women, most of whom are now in the ancestral realm, even as my mother and my father and my brother are. But I happen to be very much alive and kicking, and still very much involved with my philanthropic work. I am 90 years old this year. I was born in 1936, and so I've truly lived through a lifetime of what students, I suppose, in colleges today would consider history. And of course, that continues to play out today. So let me try and start at the beginning. I have been called many names, princess, like you did today, of course, lawyer, model, actress, I've been a diplomat, and of course, I've also been a fugitive.
Okay.
At one point, I was labeled the most beautiful woman in Uganda, but there was a time in my life when I was also called a scandal and called a threat, and a man who murdered thousands, by some estimates over 100,000 people. At one point, I became his obsession. But I call myself free. My given names are Elizabeth, Christabel, Edith, Bagaaya, Akiiki, Nyambongo. And if you've never heard that full name, then we definitely have some work to do, and we'll see how much we can get through. I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that I've written a number of biographies. The first one was The African Princess, and one that is more up to date in terms of the story of my life is Elizabeth of Toro. The Odyssey of an African Princess. I was born on the 9th of February, 1936, in Kabarole. It was the heart of the kingdom of Toro. It was a realm ancient enough to carry its own creation stories. I understand you recently spoke with someone who shared a couple of the magnificent creation stories that we have all through Africa.
Yeah.
My hometown was nestled against the magnificent Rwenzori Mountains. As a matter of fact, when I first made my way to England and my hostess was introducing me to snow, she said, "Haven't you ever seen snow?" And I said, "Yes, I have, on the mountain caps, the mountains that we call the Mountains of the Moon." My father was His Royal Highness Lieutenant Sir George David Matthew Kamurasi Rukidi III, and he was the 11th Umukama of Toro. Now, I know that you have a really astute audience, and so you may be thinking already, for such an ancient and storied kingdom, what is with all of the European names? Well, we can't go through the entire history of the colonization of Africa or how they first came with traders and missionaries. But let it suffice to say that I strongly believe that the liberation of Africa is going to require a religious liberation, where we allow whatever forms of spirituality people believe to blossom and not be threatened by anyone else's religion.
Okay.
Well, my father reigned from 1928 until 1965. Very important date, 1965, and what then happened the year later. My mother was Lady Kazia Bianjeru Bonabana Abuuli, and she was the daughter of Nicodemo Kakoro, a senior chief who himself served as Prime Minister of Toro. My mother was a woman of fierce intelligence and a great grace, from whom I inherited, I would say, a great deal of what I believe matters, although, of course, I was also deeply influenced by my father. You must understand that to be born a princess in Toro was not merely a title. It was a world. It was a way of understanding, a way of seeing the world, a way of being in the world. Yes, indeed. It was an understanding of your place in creation. And so no matter what was going on in the world, and no matter what circumstances I found myself in, it was in my DNA. Our kingdom had rituals, and we had ceremonies, and we had a language called Ruturo. And at one time, we had grammar books written in our language.
Interesting.
They scarcely exist now. And that was, by the way, the elimination of those grammar books was the doing of what we would now call the neo-colonial governments. We had, and I descend from a royal court that carried the weight of centuries. And so, for those of you in the United States of America about to celebrate, for those who will be celebrating your 250th year of existence, that is mere child's play for our kingdom. Now, I did not grow up in a palace of marble and velvet. I grew up in a palace of red earth and story, surrounded by the sounds of drums, the smell of plantain, and wood smoke. I grew up next to a lake where we could make our own salt, where my people were already well versed in iron ore. I grew up with a mother who made sure her daughter understood you are from something. And don't you ever forget it. And I never did. Not when my father decided that I needed to leave the mission schools in our kingdom and travel to a neighboring kingdom to attend their schools. And the baptism by fire of being in a place where you are a relative foreigner. You don't speak that language, although we were all Black students, all African students, and you are a princess. I know you can let your imaginations run. Those other girls were going to take me down a peg or two if they could, and they did. Now, when I moved to this new palace and to the guardianship of this king, and I was delivered to the school, to my utmost dismay, I did not have people waiting on me. The drums would sound, and we would have to hurry to the patch of land that had been assigned to us with our hoes, and we had to cut down those elephant grass. Now, if you have never dealt with elephant grass, I'm not sure if I can quite describe it to you.
It's the toughest grass.
It is elephant. Let your imagination run.
Yep.
The grass was taller than I was, and I was always a tall and rather skinny girl. But the blades were sharp.
Sharp, yeah. You are listening to Women and Resistance with Aya Fubera Eneli Esquire and Adesoji Iginla, where we honor the voices of women who have shaped history through courage and defiance. If you're finding these stories inspiring, take a moment to subscribe, share, and support this platform. Together, we amplify the voices that deserve to be heard. Now, back to the conversation.
And my goodness, my delicate hands were not used to dealing with either those blades of grass or the wooden base of the hoe. I was always the last to get my work done, and I got into plenty of trouble. Now, to make matters worse, the drums would be beaten again, and we would have to take our buckets and go to the stream to fetch water. There were girls who could carry 2 buckets, some 3. They would balance one on their heads. They walked taller than any of the models I ever saw in Europe. And they would also have 2 buckets in either hand. And they would walk with this grace and assuredness for miles. Well, I could only manage a bucket at a time. And so I often had to make multiple trips. This was not an easy adjustment. But I thoroughly enjoyed playing basketball, which I was good at. I had that height advantage, and I excelled in my studies. And soon, I even discovered that in a school not too far from us, there was a boarding school of boys, and we would start to sneak out and go into town to drink and listen to music and dance. Well, on one occasion when I was being dropped off at the palace, the king, my guardian, saw me being dropped off. He didn't say much to me, but he was sure to inform my father. And I was banished again, this time to the Sherborne, all the way in England. What a shock that was to my system. I spoke English very well, but it took some adjustment to understand the form of English that these young women spoke and just their tones and how fast they were with it. I also realized that for them who had been exposed to TV and lots of reading materials, they had a certain sophistication with the language that I didn't possess. And then to make matters worse, they decided to classify English as my mother tongue, which meant I had to learn 2 foreign languages in order to then be considered as a candidate for Cambridge. I had to learn Latin and French. Now, these young ladies had been studying these languages for 4 years. I had a year to catch up and then to take my exams. Something that was quite weird to me is the insistence on all of this physical activity. They wanted us to play lacrosse and all of these things like all day. Oh, it was too much. And I was really horrible at these games. Fortunately for me, the teachers soon understood that I actually needed to spend more time getting caught up with my schoolwork. And so I was given permission to abstain from some of these sports. There's so much I could tell about my life, but let me go back to the kingdom of Toro. Do you know that the kingdom of Toro is older than any map the British ever drew? This is important. Our history traces back to the great empire of Kitara, a vast civilization that dominated what's now called the Great Lakes region of Central Africa for centuries, before the missionaries, before the colonial agents, before the flags. The Bachwezi people, credited with founding Kitara, were so remarkable that the traditions of Toro and Bunyoro and Buganda all accorded them the status of near gods, culture bringers, cattle keepers, builders of a sophisticated world that the wider world barely knew existed. Don't buy into these Johnny-come-lately stories about who and what Africa is.
Yes, yeah.
From the Bachwezi came the Bito dynasty, the Nilotic people from the north who inherited and continued the kingdom. And from the Bito people came the royal lineage of the Toro itself. I could go on, and I know you want to hear about me, and we will. But I must say this. In approximately 1830, a prince named Kaboyo, the eldest son of the Omukama of Bunyoro, looked at the southern territory his father had sent him to oversee and collect taxes from, and he fell in love with it. Did I see you just perk up just a little bit? Yes, we had systems of governance, and yes, we had a system of taxation, but not one that taxed people to death. And all of this before the white man or even the Arabs had set foot on our continent. Now, Kaboyo, he fell in love with this area, the hills, the people, the beauty of the land along the river Muzizi, set against those ancient snow-crowned mountains. And he had befriended some very influential men there. And when he looked out, he said, this is not a place I can leave. He did not come as a colonizer or as a conqueror. So he made a decision that would echo for centuries. He stayed and he became one with the people, and he declared independence. Now, there's a lot more to that story, but we will leave it there, as he became the first Omukama of Toro. And from that act of sovereign love, from a prince who chose a land and said, this is mine, these are my people, and I serve them, because that's what it meant to be a prince or a king. You were in service to your people.
Yeah.
From that came the kingdom into which I was born. But my people, as you continue in our struggle for liberation today, understand that kingdoms and liberation itself does not survive on love alone. The truth is, they survive on power, on alliances, and sometimes on blood. By the time my great-grandfather's era arrived, Toro had weathered conquest, fragmentation, and devastating exile. In 1876, it was absorbed back into Bunyoro Kitara under the powerful King Kabarega, and then the royal line was scattered. Young princes had to flee into the night. You think the story in the Bible where King Herod wanted to kill and did kill every young male under the age of 2 that he could find, because he was afraid of the possibility of one who would rise up and rule over him, is just a story that is Relegated to the Bible? Oh no. Young princes fled into the night with their mothers and brothers, and many were hunted down and killed. And then came the late 19th century, and two very different men, one a British soldier acting for an empire. You may have heard his name before. They call him Lord Lugard, and one a French Catholic priest acting for a church, also a form of empire. Both arrived in Toro. They arrived in our kingdom within 4 years of each other, both carrying transformations that my family is still carrying till today. I will tell you their stories because it matters deeply. I want to tell you about my great-grandfather. His name was Rukibasaja Daudi, after David in the Bible, Kasagama Kimbambi IV. And his story is in many ways the story of how everything my family believed and practiced was transformed. Kasagama was born around 1860 into the royal line of Toro. But when he was still a young boy, impressionable, pay attention to what happens and where you send your children to be indoctrinated. King Barega of Bunyoro invaded and drove the royal family out, and Kasagama's father died. Two of his brothers were murdered on the orders of the Queen Mother of Ankole. As they fled through the night, he himself took refuge, first to Ankole, and then tipped off that he was going to be delivered to his death. He fled to Bugunda.
Okay.
And there he lived in exile in the household of a cousin named Yafeti, who had already been drawn to the teachings of the Church Missionary Society, the Anglican missionaries who had arrived in Buganda from England in 1877. It was in that household that my ancestor, Kasagama, a young boy, encountered Christianity for the first time. It was very unlike the spiritual teachings of his people, but he had no one else to guide him. And he attended catechism classes. He heard the gospel. He was not yet baptized, but those seeds had been planted in that young, impressionable mind, and those seeds were to take root. When in 1891, a man named Captain Frederick Lugard at the time arrived in Buganda, he was an agent of the British East Africa Company.
Yeah.
The commercial arm of British imperialism in East Africa. They always came to extract, you see. His task was to build alliances and extend British influence and secure treaties across the region. Who, my dear ones, is influencing you today? A Christian Buganda leader named Zakaria brought young Kasagama before Lugard and said, "This man is the rightful king of Toro. Help him reclaim his throne."
Here we go.
And Lugard agreed because, what do you think? If he were to restore this kingdom, it would ingratiate him and give him a foothold with the people of that kingdom, would it not?
Certainly would.
And so Lugard marched west with an army of Buganda fighters and Sudanese soldiers.
Yes.
We have definitely always played a role in our own demise. They defeated Kabarega's forces, and on August 14, 1891, at Kabarole, the very capital where I would be born 45 years later, Lugard proclaimed Kasagama the Omukama of Toro. Picture this white foreigner colonizer
proclaims, language.
It gets more interesting. For the installation was completed 2 days later, And leaning close, they sealed it.
A treaty.
In the tradition of my area, when two leaders wished to bind themselves in absolute trust that went beyond politics, beyond treaties, beyond the written word, they performed a ceremony called Omukago. Now, speak to the indigenous peoples anywhere across the world. And while you may have your beliefs and your rituals that mean something to you, you may find out that the one who partakes of it with you may not be
Share the
so
same. Yeah.
equally bound. Now, what is this Omukago ceremony? It is a blood brotherhood. Each party would make a small incision. It could be their stomach, it could be on an arm. Usually they would have a coffee bean, but it could be some other kind of food. And they would mix with the coffee bean. You would insert the coffee bean into the incision, coat it with the blood, and then the other party would swallow it. And then they would do the same and you would swallow it. Or you could mix each other's blood, and then you consume food together as bound brothers. It was the most solemn covenant a person could make. It was older than Christianity, older than Islam, older than any foreign law. To enter Omukago was to say, your life is my life. Your enemies are my enemies. To betray you is to betray myself and call down divine judgment upon my own head. Kasagama entered into a blood brotherhood with
The British.
the representative Lugard, who was taking this blood oath in place of his queen, Queen Victoria. My ancestor understood the weight of this blood brotherhood. But did the British, did it matter to them? My ancestor was a survivor. He entered into this transaction because he sought British military protection. And he sought the security of his kingdom. In exchange for Toro coming under the company's treaty of protection, he was trading one form of vulnerability to another king of African descent for what he thought was a more structured one with the most powerful empire in the world. Now, here's where the story gets even more layered. Because while Kasagama had made his peace with the British and with the Anglican missionaries, they had not necessarily made peace with him. And then a full 4 years later, here comes the French Catholic priest named Père Auguste Achte. He arrived in Fort Portal in 1895. He was a white father, a member of the Society of Missionaries of Africa, founded in Algeria, whose distinctive white robes were designed to echo the dress of North African Muslims. He had been given permission by the colonial administration to open a Catholic mission in Toro. Because in the colonial carving up of Uganda's religious territories between the British Protestants and the French Catholics, Toro had technically been designated as lying within the Catholic sphere. And it goes on. But I would say, get a copy of my book and you can delve into all the details because I know you want to talk more about my life. But I needed to share some of that history for you to understand where I came from, where I come from, and what I am rooted in. When Kasagama was baptized in 1896 by Bishop Alfred Robert Tucker, he did what most kings do. When he converted, he brought his entire household and kingdom with him. He was asked by the church to repudiate all but one of his wives. And he did so. He gave up 10 wives and kept his 11th, his favorite, Omogo Adiere Damali Tabitwa, whom he then remarried in a Christian ceremony at St. John's Cathedral in Kabarole on May 4th, 1896. So hopefully that helps you understand all of those Western Christian names that I listed out, including mine, Elizabeth, because at this time, Kasagame had wholesale given up our form of spirituality and embraced Christianity. He freed his domestic slaves. He required his pages to attend Christian classes. He gave all his royal support to the Protestant mission, ensuring that Toro would be an Anglican kingdom. And he built the first schools in Toro, including the girls' school that I attended, Kibambe Girls' School, named after him. The Christianity that transformed Toro came braided together with colonialism. The same British who brought the Bible also brought the treaties that made Uganda a protectorate by 1894. Yes, Kasagama's blood covenant with Lugard gave Toro protection from Kabarega, a fellow African. But what it did was give Britain a foothold from which it would not move for 70 years. My father, Lieutenant Sir George David Matthew Kamaruasi Rukidi III, was a product of these mission schools. He was also educated at Bordeaux, and he became a deeply Anglican man, if you will. He was a man who was knighted by the British Crown. He sat at the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in London in 1953. And my father believed with his whole heart that the education those schools had built was a tool his children could and must use. And it was that vision that caused my father to insist that I go off to England for my studies, being the only Black girl at my school, and that eventually sent me to Cambridge. These times away from home really caused me to have to dig deep into what I remembered as a child. I had been taught well, but also many of my formative years was not spent in the cradle of my own kingdom. It was spent learning from strangers. I went on to attend Cambridge, where I was only the third African woman to ever be admitted to the school. The two other young women, one came from Nigeria and one from Sierra Leone. I became a lawyer, and my father came all the way to England to celebrate my successful graduation. I must tell you, those were pretty heady days. Almost all the young people, the students that I was surrounded by were children of the aristocrats. And I guess I would have been something like an anomaly, but one that they found delightful. I had a great sense of humor, and I had a way with people. And I got invited to balls and all kinds of social outings where I dressed in the finest couture of the day. This would come in handy later. Shortly after I was admitted to the bar, and I was to begin a 6-month internship, I got a message. My father, who had been increasingly depressed by the way that the British had imposed their will on his kingdom, the ways that they had restricted our ability to make our own wealth, and they were wholesale carting off the wealth of our kingdom. My father had determined that he would never live in exile again, but that he would go out on his own terms. And the last time I saw him, I said, "I think you're dying." And he said, "How would you know?" And I said, "Because all the time I've spent with you, I know you well." And so I received that call right before I was to start my internship, having become a barrister. And I immediately returned home. Now, my father had always been grooming me for power. See, because in our tradition, the king's closest advisor is always his sister, who is known as the Batebe. And my brother would one day ascend to the throne and I would be his Batebe. It happened much more quickly than we expected. But in December of 1965, I hurriedly returned home to bury my father, but also to be by my brother's side for his coronation as king. My brother, Ruki Rabashaji, Patrick, David, Matthew, Ramukoya, Kaboya, Olimi III, was crowned the 12th Omukama of Toro. But guess where his coronation took place? It took place at St. John's Cathedral in Kabarole. This was on March 2nd, 1966. And at that coronation, in accordance with ancient royal tradition, I was bestowed the title and office of Batebe, Princess Royal, the most powerful woman in the Tooro Kingdom, the principal advisor to the king. Now, what is it that women in the Western world have been fighting for? Respect, reciprocity, equality. And unfortunately, so many of our men on the continent of Africa have forgotten how things used to be, as you will see in my life as well. In that role was the living embodiment of continuity between reigns. I was 29 years old, a Cambridge-educated barrister, and now Batebe. But you've got to picture what was happening in the greater Uganda at this time. Pay attention to the dates. Uganda in 1966 was electric with possibility. Do you remember when independence came to Uganda?
60s.
1962. The whole continent was rising. Ghana, Kenya, Tanzania. I had met the great Jomo Kenyatta as a student when I was in London. Interesting that I would be suddenly overcome by a fit of coughing when I say Jomo Kenyatta's name, because I was later on in life to speak to him quite sternly about the actions he was taking
To take a glass of water.
that now tarnished the legacy that he could have left and the idea of who I knew him to be. Excuse me, please. But let me tell you, as important as milk was to us in the kingdom of Toro, cattle rearing was one of the major aspects of our kingdom.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, we used everything from the cow, from the milk to the hide, to the flesh, to the horns,
To the
every
shoe.
aspect of the cow, for furniture, for clothing, for everything. And one of the things that the British did was destroy and take away our cows, our cattle. Pay attention to the tactics used in one place, because you see those same tactics repeated in so many other places.
Yes.
For what happened to the Native Americans in their relationship to the buffalo?
Buffalo, yeah.
Well, milk was important to us, but I tell you, politics in newly independent countries can curdle faster than milk. And Uganda, unfortunately, was no exception, my friends. Prime Minister Milton Obote was so threatened by the traditional kingdoms. He saw them not as cultural institutions from which the nation state could learn and build on. He saw them as political rivals. And so in April of 1966, he sent troops to storm the Buganda Palace at Mengo. And King Mutesa II of Buganda fled into exile. He eventually made his way to London, where he died a mere 2 years later. And then in September of 1967, Obote abolished all of Uganda's traditional kingdoms by constitutional decree. One man, centuries of governance with the stroke of a pen. Toro, Buganda, Ankole, Bunyoro, gone on paper by a signature. My brother fled not to London, but to Kenya, where he continued with his studies. He had an opportunity to flee to London, but he felt that it was important as the king to stay close enough to home that he may return and not just abandon his people. He lived in exile in Kenya, a king without a throne, and I feared for his life every single night. And I was a virtual prisoner in my own country, a princess with no kingdom, a lawyer in a country that had just abolished the institution that gave me my very name. So what would you do? What should your response be when the ground is pulled from beneath your feet? For some of you, given the rumblings in the United States of America, this might be a question you want to sit with. For me, it meant that I found new ground. Couldn't quite figure out how to get out of the country just yet. I was obviously under surveillance. But Princess Margaret of the United Kingdom, whom I had met during my time in London, extended an invitation for me to participate in a Commonwealth charity fashion show in London. My government was not so enthused by this, but I accepted, and I convinced them that I would be representing Uganda. And indeed, the clothes that I modeled were made by a Ugandan artist. In that dress, I walked into that runway. I must say, I cut a rather striking figure. Tall, with a neck that went on literally for feet. Beautiful features that they had never quite seen in that way. I was inundated immediately with modeling offers. Fashion editors, magazine covers, agents. Jacqueline Kennedy, then Jackie Onassis, met me at a party, looked at me the way a woman looks at another woman when she sees something extraordinary. And she said, "You must come to New York." And when I did, she introduced me to Diana Vreeland, the legendary editor-in-chief of American Vogue. I signed with a Ford modeling agency. Now you might say, a barrister modeling? But I felt that it would be a way to still make an impact, convincing people of who we are as a people, making connections that I wasn't sure how they would come to bear, but I hoped they would. And then in 1969, I was the first Black model to grace the pages of Harper's Bazaar, then Vogue, then Life, then the Look magazine, then Ebony, a 4-page spread in American Vogue. I was making history, 1 page at a time. But modeling was not my dream. Law was, but if staying visible would keep me alive and connected to power, that's what I needed to do. And I did that until it came a day where I could do what I was actually born to do. I wasn't just modeling. I was surviving. I was networking. I was meeting presidents and prime ministers and foreign ministers at dinner parties in Georgetown and salons. Yes, darling. Powerful men and wanting to be around models didn't just start with the Epstein files. But this is what I would say to my young daughters. Never let anyone think that beauty and brains are opposites. In the right hands, beauty is a strategy. In 1970, I was cast in the film adaptation of Chinua Achebe's masterpiece, Things Fall Apart. It was kind of combined with No Longer at Ease, and I played Clara, a woman caught between love and the crushing weight of tradition. The filming took me to Lagos, Nigeria. And I was moved because Lagos was unlike Kampala or Nairobi as I had known them. See, because in Kampala and Nairobi, there are different forms of colonialism. And in these areas, everything was dominated by Asians and Europeans. So getting to Lagos and seeing Black people, Africans in charge of almost everything, now that was a change. Africans in charge, African stories told by African cameras on African soil in 1970. Wow, that experience planted something deep in me, a fuller understanding of what Pan-Africanism actually felt like when it was lived rather than just preached. Then, January 25th, 1971, Idi Amin launched his coup. By the way, you have to read my book to find out the rest of the story with that filming, because the Nigerian government wasn't so keen on that story being told.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
They later censored and cut off parts of the story. In fact, they were actually going to force me out of Nigeria, which means that the film would not be shot. And it was only in making that concession, you've got to go back and study the Civil War in Nigeria and understand these dates that I'm giving you are not happenstance. What had happened in Nigeria right before 1970 was crucial. But Idi Amin launched his coup January 25th, 1971, and Milton Obote, who himself had also been responsible for tens of thousands of deaths, he was overthrown while he was out of the country, and Nyerere, who was a close friend of his, granted him refuge in Tanzania. Pan-Africanism. We must understand that when friendships threaten our common humanity and liberation, they must be re-examined. I'm going to go a little faster here because I'm aware of the time. The stories you have heard of Idi, a lot of them are true. I will not perform outrage for you. I will not perform fear either. What I will give you is the truth stated plainly. When Idi Amin first seized power, there was rejoicing in the streets. Many Ugandans felt something close to relief. Obote had been brutal. Amin released political prisoners. He promised elections, and he reinstated all of the traditional kingdoms. Is this a dawn of a new age? I was approached through a government minister, Kironde, who suggested to Amin that I, a princess, a lawyer, an international figure, would make an extraordinary roving ambassador for Uganda, capitalizing on the goodwill that I had built up across the Western world as a model and actress. I was hesitant, but my mother and some other advisors said, go, serve your country. Not Idi Amin, but your country. And I served with everything in me. Because when I returned to Uganda, I returned for Uganda, not for Amin. I returned for my people, for my brother who had been sitting in exile in Kenya. I returned for the women I would later address at Makerere University, urging them to not let fear negate your femininity or prevent you from accomplishing your goals. I told them it is admirable for a woman to be educated, to be ambitious even, and to be financially secure. I said that publicly. I said that in 1972, and I said it under a military government, and I meant every word then, and I mean every word even more now. As a roving ambassador, I traveled to capitals across the world. I met Jomo Kenyatta again. He called me his daughter, and I maintained that relationship with care, not knowing how urgently I would one day need it. But remember what I told you about how quickly milk can curdle? Well, Ugandan politics curdles even faster. You would have to go read the story of Idi Amin, because if I bypass and tell that whole story, you would be here through the night and we still wouldn't be done. Idi Amin, when I met him, was fluent in multiple African languages, but he wasn't that good at English. He did pick it up over time. He had 4 wives, and at one point, he decided to divorce them all. And for one of his wives, Kay, with whom I had a close relationship, she was found not just murdered, but mutilated in the trunk of the car of a doctor who was rather renowned for committing abortions. Her father says she had been feeling ill And the doctor came to visit her, and she got into the car with him. That doctor later supposedly poisoned his entire family, his wife and 6 children. They survived, but he did take his life. It's the narrative that has been given. Amin not only showed no remorse for her death, he took the children she had borne for him to the morgue and, pointing at their mother, said, "Your mother was a bad woman. Many disappeared and many murdered. Some estimates say 100 to 500,000 Ugandans killed during the Idi Amin regime. I went from being the roving ambassador to being the foreign minister. Idi Amin loved to ridicule his ministers and anyone who served him in public. Does that sound familiar to any leader that is currently out here in the world being loud and bombastic, making his own laws up as he goes along? That's exactly what Idi Amin did.
Little
You may
Michael.
remember when he kicked out the British agents. You may remember that the Israelis played a huge role in his coup that unseated Obote. You may remember that he now broke ranks with the Israelis and became very close to the Arabs, including Gaddafi. And Gaddafi was none too fond of me, particularly when he found out that I had now been appointed as the minister for foreign affairs. And soon Idi Amin became obsessed with me. He decided, as powerful, violent men sometimes decide, about women who are brilliant and beautiful, and deeply unimpressed by them, because I could read him. My father had taught me, my mother had taught me, my studies in history and politics and law had sharpened my ability to read the room and to understand politics and personalities. And he was a man easily influenced by flattery. Well, he became obsessed with me, and he decided that his latest conquest would be to have me as his wife. I reminded him that he was already married, and when he divorced his wives, I implored him to stay with at least one of them. He invited me to accompany him on a trip to Saudi Arabia and made his intentions unmistakably clear. Now, he had been hinting at it and suggesting in the past, but this time being forced to sit right next to him, and I declined, and he demoted me. And then he sent someone whose name might sound familiar to those of you in the United States of America. Roy Innis, the leader of the Congress of Racial Equality Corps. He sent him to me to persuade me to accept his proposal. He weaponized the civil rights leader to pressure an African princess into marrying a military dictator. I told Roy Innis in no uncertain terms, now, I imagine that your generation would say it differently, but you must remember my upbringing and my comportment. But I imagine it might start with a word that starts with an H and then the no. And then Idi Amin made his most calculated move of all. I told you, appointing me as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the first woman in Uganda's history to hold a cabinet post. He had murdered the previous minister shortly after he dismissed him publicly. And now he gave me that seat. That was not generosity, that was a trap. I wrote in my autobiography that he seemed to feel personally responsible for my achievements, and that marrying me would be a way of increasing his stature. He thought the power would make me grateful. He thought the office would make me compliant. He did not know me. I served Uganda, not him. In October of 1974, I led our delegation to the 29th session of the United Nations General Assembly in New York. And if you go on YouTube, you can look up a video of my remarks. I had my hair plaited in a very African style. I was always going to represent my people. I met with Henry Kissinger, the United States Secretary of State. At that time, they would always host a luncheon for all the African foreign ministers. And standing toe to toe with Kissinger, I told him that he had to support the African liberation movement and that there really could be no peace. They did not, as an entity, the United Nations, create a new world economic order which would necessitate decolonization and an equitable distribution of world wealth.
Yeah.
I concluded my speech to Kissinger by asking him not only to support the African liberation movements, but to visit Africa instead of depending on distorted reports about the African people and their society. As a superstar in the eyes of the West and other parts of the world, Henry Kissinger represented a concept that was non-existent in Africa. The press carried my speech in every word. And when I returned from New York, passing through Paris, through the Orly airport in transit, having still rebuffed Idi Amin, he launched his smear campaign. He told the world on public radio, without shame, that I, Princess Elizabeth Toro, who had just addressed the United Nations General Assembly, he told them that I had had sex with a Frenchman in a toilet at Orly Air. The oldest weapon, sexual slander. Take a woman's body, even if it's just in mere words, and destroy her credibility. Reduce her to a rumor. Silence her with shame. He dismissed me from the cabinet, and then he had me arrested. I was taken to the State Research Center's headquarters in Kampala. Oh, the turns of my life. The State Research Center headquarters was the most feared address in Uganda. People went in,
Never came out.
and most did not come out. At least not alive. I am thinking of Mama Africa Winnie Mandela and the torture she went through, most of which she never detailed. And it would be no different for me. They tortured me, and they shaved my head with broken glass. They could find no crime to charge me with. So I actually survived the headquarters, and they placed me under house arrest. But it wasn't because there was not a will to kill me. That speech before the world, those connections I had made around the Western world, and my deep and personal relationship with Jomo Kenyatta was what spared my life. In fact, Jomo Kenyatta sent a message to Idi Amin and said, "You better not kill her, or I will be at war with you." I sat in that house surrounded by their agents. I thought about my mother. I thought about my father's kingdom. I thought about the runway in London and the courtroom at Gray's Inn and the film set in Lagos and every version of myself I had been allowed to become in freedom. And I made a decision. I was not going to die in that house. I was not going to be put under arrest until the world forgot about me and carried on with other things. On the night of February 8th, 1975, one day before my 39th birthday, I escaped. I crossed the border into Kenya, and Jomo Kenyatta, who, like I said, had already telephoned Amin and personally warned him that no harm should come to me, he helped me. He saved my life. And from Kenya, I made my way to Vienna, then to London, and I was exiled again. Like another Mama Africa.
Yeah.
Remember?
Mariah Makeba.
But let me tell you about fighting back. With no cabinet post, no title, no kingdom, I got a lawyer. His name was Peter Carter Ruck, the most formidable libel attorney in all of England. And I sued every newspaper that had printed Amin's lies as though they were facts. The Sun, the Sunday Telegraph, the Daily Express, the Daily Mirror, the Daily Mail, 5 of the most powerful newspapers in Britain. I sued every single one of them. And I won. I collected damages from all 5 because English law, however flawed, however imperfect, and there's certainly many imperfections, recognize the simple, inescapable truth that what Amin said about me in that airport toilet in Paris was a lie, a fabrication, a weapon of sexual slander, and every newspaper that had printed it as fact without verification, without fairness, without any attempt at truth, had committed libel. A woman who had just escaped torture, fled across an African border in the dark, arrived in London with nothing. I filed lawsuits against 5 of the most powerful institutions, media institutions in Britain, and I won. Let me wrap up, because our time has gone long. Let me speak about the love of my life, Wilbur. While in exile in London, I met Prince Wilberforce Nyabongo, son of Prince Leo Sharp Ochaki of the Toro royal family. He was not an outsider. He was a man who knew what it was to carry a kingdom inside you, while the world barely acknowledged its existence. He was 18 years younger than I was, and I want you to sit with that as well, because there's so many limitations put on women. I felt no complication about our age difference. I felt love. I felt joy. And I followed my heart. I brushed his hair daily. I washed his feet with warm water. I massaged his body. I, a princess, a barrister, a minister, an international figure, a model. I did this for the man that I loved. Both things, both entirely true. A woman can be so many things all at once, and the world needs to get comfortable with that. Wilberforce loved the sky. He was drawn to aviation, and he became an aviation engineer. And he wanted to fly. And he died in a plane crash. Idi Amin was overthrown in 1979, but then Obote came back into power. And he continued with his madness. His hostility to the monarchy had not diminished. And therefore, although I had returned to Uganda with Wilbur after Idi Amin's overthrow, with Obote on the hunt again, I escaped again to London. In 1981, Wilbur and I got married. And in December of 1986, Wilbur died in a plane crash. He was 32 years old. I was 50. And it felt like my world came crashing down around my feet. I have outlived so much, but nothing prepared me for the loss of my love, Wilbur. I had been made an ambassador. I resigned that ambassadorship because I needed time to grieve. I needed time to just be a human being, not a diplomat. And I turned to charity work, to writing, and I turned to my 3-year-old nephew, born to my brother, who had also died prematurely. And I was the Batebe, and my 3-year-old nephew had now been crowned king, and I was his advisor. In 1993, the government of President Museveni, a name that still exists and of which I need to be very careful because I currently live in Uganda, he restored Uganda's traditional kingdoms. After 26 years of being abolished by decree, our kingdoms came back by decree. My brother, who had been living in exile in Nairobi, came back. But like I said, he died. And Oyo Nyimba Kabamba, my nephew, became king. My brother was only 49 years old when he died. I helped raise my nephew. I returned to diplomatic service, ambassador to Germany, ambassador to the Vatican, high commissioner to Nigeria. I kept working because the work of Africa is not done. The work of Uganda. I worked under Museveni. I had high hopes. And today at 90 years old, I am no longer actively involved in politics in that way. I see what again has befallen my dear country. But I am a key figure behind the Batebe of Toro Foundation, to which I devote most of my time. My foundation works to preserve and promote the culture, heritage, and the development of the Tooro Kingdom and its people because we must plant our seeds into our young people. It's a work of restoration. It's the slow, necessary and loving work that must be undertaken across the landscape of Africa to remember and recover who we are and to figure out how we use that to rebuild. I came from complexity. I am that complexity. And I am still here. I want you to know that you must first know who you are. Your identity is key. A man may have shaved my head with broken glass. He thought he took something from me, but you can't take what is in my DNA. So first, you must know your identity. Second, you must be prepared. I walked into every room in my life with the best education I can get, with the deepest preparation I could muster. I did not rely on beauty or one thing or the other. I always sought to be prepared. It takes discipline. You must embrace that. The third is community. Jomo Kenyatta or Princess Margaret or Jackie Kennedy or Peter Carter Rock or any of the people that I met. Those relationships helped to change the fate of my kingdom and of my fate. The women of Toro who kept the knowledge of our rituals alive in their memories for 26 years, while the government pretended that the kingdom did not exist, it was on their communal memory that we were able to rebuild. The fourth is courage. Courage is not the absence of fear. I was afraid through most of what I did in my life. I was afraid for every moment I spent in those headquarters in Kampala. Courage is not fearlessness. Courage is deciding that what you're moving towards is worth more than your terror of what stands between you and it. And the last thing I would say is learning to grieve, but not giving up. To grieve and to go on. You are allowed to break. You are allowed to retreat, but you are required to return. I know I took up so much of your time, but there's so much to this story and so much I wanted to impart with our young people, especially the women, but also the men. I am Elizabeth, Princess of Toro. Batebe.
Yes. Thank you so much for joining us today on Women in Resistance. The reason why we have this podcast is so that stories like yours can be highlighted and people can take heed and lessons from. And it's also powerful that you're still with us. So that continues to be a guiding light. That said, we've come to the end of this week's episode of Women in Resistance. Next week, it will be the turn of Mary Fields. Next week is Mary Fields. And so, if you found this episode moved you, please share, leave us a review, which is very key, especially when the day after on YouTube, tag someone you think would want to know about this story. It helps take the story to where it needs to get to. And again, join us every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for conversations about women who refuse to be erased. Because that's what we do here. We place them on the platform and allow them to speak to you. So with that said, Elizabeth of Toro, thank you for coming through. And to our esteemed community in the audience, you're not even the audience, you're now community, family. And most thank you for coming through, spending your time with us every Wednesday. Until next week, it's good night and God bless. That is it for this episode of Women and Resistance. Thank you for joining us in amplifying the voices of women who challenged injustice and changed the course of history. Be sure to subscribe, share, and continue the conversation. Together, remember, we honor the past, act in the present, and shape the future. Until next time, stay inspired and stay in resistance.